welcome to the webinar on action learning, and specifically the 10 tips on using action learning in organizations. My name is Tom, and I have the pleasure of leading While Poland, the Polish affiliate of the World Institute for Action Learning. Now, I'm joined today by an amazing guest. My guest is an author of, I guess, over 25 books on organizational development, human and organizational learning, leadership development, and of course, action learning. He is a business consultant and a professor at George Washington University. So I know you guys know this person and he needs no introduction, but I felt like I had to say this. So my guest today is Dr. Marquardt. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Fine, fine. Welcome to everybody from Poland. It's good to be on the computer and video conference with you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks for being with us here. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me, before we begin, give you some logistics of the webinar. And it really boils down to one thing. If you get disconnected somehow for any reason, you can also dial in via phone and listen to the webinar. So, on the screen, you see the phone number for Polish people, because we have a majority of Polish people, and the PIN number you will need. We also have some people from the United States and other parts of Europe. So for your local numbers, what you should do is go to your email confirmation that you got after you registered for this webinar, and there will be a link for a list of local numbers that you can use if you ever get disconnected. So make sure you note this down. If you feel like your internet is not 100% stable, note the PIN down so you can use them. You can use these things later on. What we're going to do in this webinar is divide the whole thing into 3 parts. Part number 1 will be devoted to the basics of action learning, because I know we have a variety of people in the audience. We have some trained, certified action learning coaches that are very well familiar with action learning. But we also have some people who are eager to learn about it, that don't know action learning very well yet. So just to make sure everybody is on the same page, before we move on to the 10 tips, we will explain what action learning is. We'll tell you the components of action learning, the benefits of action learning. We'll explain a little bit how action learning meetings look like, and then we will move on to the main content, the 10 tips of action learning. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A session. So if you have questions as we go, what you should do is probably save them for the end. The reason is it's really difficult to deliver content and look at the chat box to answer questions, especially if you're a man. Like, I'm a man, I really need to focus on one thing only. So it makes it easier if we deliver what we want to say to you first, and then we will have some 10-15 minutes to answer your questions. Mike, is there anything you would like to add before we begin?
No, other than that, we hope we provide an interesting, informative session, and we get some good questions at the end.
Excellent. Action learning is based on questions, so we'll be looking forward to your questions at the end. So let's begin, and first let me explain what action learning is. When I'm asked what is action learning, I usually try to say in one sentence that action learning is a process, it's a methodology that's designed for groups or teams, and that has 2 major purposes. Purpose number 1 is solving complex problems that have no identifiable or easily identifiable solution. Complex in terms of nature. When we have a complex problem, we don't necessarily know where it comes from, and most of all, we don't know what to do because expertise is not enough. So when an expert comes, he say, we can do this, we can do that, we can do something else, we don't know. So what we really need is not only expertise, but also some breakthrough thinking. So we use action learning to solve problems. It's a problem-solving methodology. So we have action, but except action, we also have learning. And learning here is understood in a slightly different way than we understand it in schools. So it's not about gaining hard programmed knowledge, although it's important and we use it. It's not about learning things in a workshop manner, but rather it's drawing conclusions from how we work in order to work better in a second. So it's applied learning. It's a learning that you can instantaneously apply when a team is working together. Every now and again, they stop to draw conclusions from how they work and instantly apply what they have learned in order to work better. So basically here, you could say that learning is about increasing performance. So it's a process that allows problem solving and at the same time improving people's performance, learning competences. You could also consider action learning as a management tool. It's a tool for consultants, tools for even for managers that want to help their teams work in a better way. Mike, here I have a question to you. Now that I have explained the basic definition of action learning, you've been involved with action learning for, I guess, over 20 years. What's action learning to you today? What will be your definition after all these years of using action learning in different contexts? How do you see action learning?
Well, as you mentioned, Tom, action learning is built around problems, and the more difficult and complex a problem is, the more critical the team that's working on the problem has to be smart. And so the group, as it's learning, it's more quickly able to solve the problem, but not only solve it, but to solve it in a creative, innovative way. So action learning, over the years, I've discovered the immense power and magic of action learning, that it's the learning that makes the problem more easily understood and solved in a more creative way.
Okay, thanks so much, Mike. And we will now move on to the core of action learning. And that is the 6 components of an action learning program. When I heard you say or speak about the first components, Mike, I remember watching your presentation about action learning that actually made me go to New York, to America, to learn action learning from B. Carson and Andrew Verhamen. So I remember you spoke about the 6 components as the core of action learning. If you really want to remember what action learning is built upon, you should remember about the 6 components. So I will give you here the floor, the space to talk about the 6 basic elements of action learning.
Okay, when I first heard about action learning nearly 25 years ago now, I was very impressed by the power of action learning, and so I did some research. I looked at, there were different types of action learning around the world. Every organization or theorist had a different type of action learning. It was only used maybe by 20 or 30 organizations at that point. Now it's used by thousands of organizations. And I discovered that there were 6 essential components to action learning. And if you had all 6 of these, I could assure you that you would be successful in terms of coming up with great breakthrough problem solving. You'd come up with a team that enjoyed working together and were successful working together. You have the full power of action learning. So all 6 of these components are necessary. If you miss any of them, you don't get the full benefit of action learning. The first and most important component is that you have to have an urgent, important problem. The more urgent the problem is, the more action you're going to get. The more complex the problem is, the more learning that the group is going to acquire. So if you don't have an urgent, complex problem, you don't have the energy, you don't have the learning. The second component is that you have a group of people who are working together to solve this problem. And we have discovered that the ideal size of this group is 4 to 8 people. If you have more than 8 people, you don't keep everybody engaged. It becomes complex. People drop in, drop out. And you need at least 4 people so you get the full energy and synergy of 4 people and perspectives and so forth. The third component is that in action learning, you work differently than a typical problem-solving group. Typically in a problem-solving group, everybody spends their energy making statements, trying to impress each other with their knowledge or trying to push each other to adopt their solution to the problem or their understanding of the problem. In action learning, it's just the opposite. Everyone spends their energy trying to get ideas from each other. And so you ask questions saying, well, what do you think we should do? Or how do you see this problem? And we know from psychology and many other disciplines that we tend to hear what we're asked. And we tend to either filter or reject statements, particularly statements that are contrary to ours or we haven't thought about yet. So when the action learning group is working, people tend to listen and support one another because they're getting asked questions which make them feel important, that their ideas are important. So the language of action learning is questions rather than statements. The fourth component of action learning is that in an action learning group, everyone is expected to take action during the session. That may last for an hour, it may last for 2 hours. It may be one session only, depending on the scale of the problem and the time frame, or it may last 2 or 3 sessions. But everyone's expected to take actions, make decisions during the action learning process. And at the end of every session, individuals or teams or small groups are expected to take action between sessions. I think many of us are frustrated that during a problem-solving session, at the end of the session, there are no actions. No decisions are made, except maybe when the next meeting is. So in action learning, there's always action. The fifth component of action learning is that the group is there for 2 purposes. One is to solve the problem, come up with great strategies, but second, it's there to learn. Everyone's expected to learn, develop their leadership skills, develop their team skills, with the understanding that the more we learn, the better we can solve this problem. But the more we learn, the better we can apply these ideas, these skills, these strategies throughout our organization or throughout our lives. So when you are a participant in an action learning session, you learn things that about yourself, about leadership, about organizational work that you can use the rest of your life. So solving the problem may be worth, $1 million to the organization, but if the organization can develop 5 great leaders who are learners, that may be worth $1 billion to the organization. The final component of action learning, there's one person in the group who's there to assure that the group gets action, solves the problem, as well as learn. And so this generally requires a skilled person. The World Institute of Action Learning realized that the more skilled the coach is, the more effective the team will be in solving the problem, and the better skills that are developed by each member of the group. So the action learning coach is there to assure the success of the group. He or she is not involved in working on the problem, but is there to ask questions that enable the group to become more competent and enable the group to develop great actions for this particular problem and to apply those actions to other parts of the organization. So those 6 things, if they're integrated, I can assure you that you're going to have a very successful team that solves a complex problem in a great way.
Thanks so much for explaining this, Mike. And except for the 6 components, the part of the core of action learning, one of the other most important factor of action learning are the 2 ground rules that we use in action learning meetings. So in Poland, trainers, workshop trainers are very much used to coming up with a contract with the group and specifying the norms beforehand, before we start working during a workshop. Now, an action learning coach does not really do it. In some cases, it's probably possible, but we only have 2 norms, and they're really strong, and they are called ground rules, because every time we do action learning, you have to follow these 2 ground rules. Ground rule number 1 is that statements may only be made in response to questions. A question can be asked of anyone, by anyone, at any time. One question may generate 1 response, many responses. There can be a lot of questions without an answer. There can be a lot of answers to 1 question. So it's really flexible. However, you really have to remember that if you make a statement like you criticize someone, you give an idea, and when no one is asking about it, you want to judge an idea, or come on with a long monologue, the coach will probably stop you and ask a question like, what question are you answering right now? Or can you phrase that in the form of a question, because we agreed that every time you make a statement, you really need to have a question before. Now, the reason why we do that there are basically three reasons why we want that. The reason number one is that it makes the group conversation very focused. There are no digressions, no side topics, no other things, because we know we have limited time, and in that limited time we want to perform as high as we can. The second reason why we use this ground rule is that we really want to analyze the problem efficiently, get down to the root, the core of the problem, in order to identify it in the best possible way and generate the best possible solutions. If you work as coaches, you know that questions trigger creativity. Questions will make people think about different things. So that's why we use that ground rule. And the third important reason is that this ground rule enables people to practice every possible leadership skills. We'll talk about that a little more later on in the webinar, but during an action learning, you can practice every single chosen leadership skill, and it's very much due to that ground rule, that kind of communication, that allows people to do it. Now, the second ground rule is that you have the coach that Mike has just mentioned when he was speaking about the 6 components, and the second ground rule is that the coach has the authority to intervene every time he or she sees the opportunity for learning in the group. So the coach does not facilitate the meeting, in a sense that he does not give the stages of the problem-solving process, does not give the tools, doesn't tell the team what to do, but is only interested in the process, in how they are working together, and is more like an observer, but he is a participative observer. So the coach watches the group, and every time the coach has impression that they can be working more efficiently in some aspect, he will say, let's stop for a second, let's take a look at the pulse of the team. He will ask some questions, make the team draw conclusions in order that they learn and immediately work better in a second. So we have these 2 ground rules, and I have a question to you, Mike. Originally in action learning, there were no ground rules, or at least not these 2 ground rules. Why did you decide to apply these 2 ground rules, and why not more?
Well, over the years, as I became more immersed in what action learning was, I realized that sometimes action learning would work, sometimes it would not, sometimes you came up with great ideas, sometimes you did not, sometimes the group worked well together, sometimes they did not. And over the years, I realized that if I applied these 2 ground rules, it transformed the group. And these were the only 2 ground rules I needed. It was amazing that with the simplicity of action learning, it has so much ability to handle complexity in difficult situations. So oftentimes when I first began, I would allow the group to begin in a typical problem-solving mode where everybody would be talking at the same time, or forcing their ideas or strategies on each other, ignoring or being insensitive to each other. And so these 2 ground rules enabled every group to be creative, to be respectful for each other, to learn from each other, to care for each other. And the coach, with his or her skills, could enable a group to accomplish something in an hour what might normally have taken a day or a week. We have many examples of organizations like Microsoft, where the direct senior manager for Xbox said that with action learning, he got more done in 2 hours than he normally got done in 2 weeks, because of these 2 ground rules and the power and simplicity of action learning. So over the 25 years, I developed these 2 ground rules, and I felt that was all that was necessary to enable a group. Some groups had worked together for 20 years or 10 years and were never effective. They quickly changed. And a group that never met before, with these 2 ground rules and using the 6 components, they were effective within 15 minutes.
Thanks so much, Mike. And the last thing we want to speak about is why do we use action learning in the organization? So what benefits action learning brings? And in other words, it's also for what purposes action learning is applied in organizations. Mike, I will give you the floor here to explain these benefits.
Okay, the wonderful thing about action learning, it provides 4 benefits at the same time. and they really require you have to have all four benefits. In other words, to develop leadership competencies, which action learning does very well, it can develop every leadership competency that an organization needs and develop those skills quickly in an effective way. But you cannot develop leadership skills except when you're working in a group. All leadership skills are developed in working with teams on solving problems. The more complex a problem is, the more you develop your leadership skills, the more opportunity for the team to grow. The better team you become, the more you begin changing the organization in which that team occurs. So action learning develops all of these four benefits. At the beginning of every session of action learning, the members identify a leadership skill which is important for them, or their boss has said to them it's important. And whatever leadership skill they choose, it will be developed because every leadership skill can be developed if you are working in a group trying to solve a complex problem. The second benefit of action learning is that it does enable you to solve sometimes problems which you thought were unsolvable more quickly in a creative way. And that's many organizations, that's why they choose action learning. They have problems that they have not been able to solve any other way. The best teams are built not by being told how to be a good team or being given guidelines or directions. You become a great team by having success together in solving a problem. So again, my experience has been that most teams are ineffective. Most problem-solving groups don't work well together. And I've heard statements from people who, the very first time in action learning, they said this is the best team they've ever been in. And they've been in teams for 20 years. But their first action learning team, they immediately said this is the very best team because we got our problem solved, we achieved our objective, we worked well together, and we kept improving as a team. And the final benefit of action learning is it begins changing the culture. Individuals, when they're a member of the action learning team, they go back into their organization, they start acting differently. They ask better questions. They recognize the value of learning, how learning enables them to achieve their goals better, their colleagues' goals. And so the organization starts changing and becomes a learning organization, which is a wonderful place to work and an organization that is ultimately much more successful than a non-learning organization. So action learning achieves all four benefits at the same time, and necessarily they have to occur with each other.
So a quick question here, Mike. So which benefit have you seen the most wanted from organizations, so to speak? So according to your experience, why do usually organizations want action learning?
I think globally, most organizations choose action learning as a way to develop their leaders. So high potential leaders, new leaders, senior leaders. So perhaps many organizations around the world, probably 70–80% of all organizations say they use action learning, a form of action learning, to develop their leaders because they recognize they cannot maybe either afford the time or the money to send them out to a leadership program, and they develop their leadership skills much more competently while they work on real problems with real people in a real organization. So that's probably the main reason. A second, I think, more in today's environment, more and more organizations are starting to use action learning to solve the problems they have. The problems that organizations face today are more difficult and complex than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And they realize that only a group that is a smart group can solve a problem where in the past an individual person, a brilliant leader, could solve it. Now only brilliant teams can solve the problems. So those are probably two most important purposes, but I think many organizations want to become learning organizations because it gives them a highly competitive advantage. And all organizations realize teams are important for their success. So they're all important, but I would suspect historically and use-wise that leadership was the first, and then problem solving, and the other two have become more important recently, in recent years.
Okay, thanks so much, Mike. And now we're moving on to the main content of the webinar, which is 10 tips of using the action learning methodology in organizations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, tip number one is do not use action learning for everything. Like Mike said before in the 6 components part, action learning is designed to solve complex problems. If you have a meeting that it's supposed to come up with the strategy or exchange experiences between people, maybe come up with a list of best practices for a manager in our company, mission, a vision of the company, it's not going to work very well. I know because I tried it. It worked. It was a success when I used action learning as a beginning coach with a small team that wanted to come up with a vision and a mission statement of their team. It worked. It was a success, but it was a struggle. The first ground rule basically analyzes the problem, turns on creativity, and sometimes when you want to do other things, not really solve a problem, it's better to use a different methodology, maybe hire a task facilitator. However, if you have an urgent, complex, important problem that you really can influence, you can take actions upon, then action learning is a great idea. Also important, as you can see on the slide, is review the problem statement before the session. Very often problem presenters will present problems in a messy way. It's really a good idea to meet with them beforehand and agree on how the problem statement will be presented. And again, in the third bullet point, if you can, try to select problems that are a good opportunity for learning leadership skills and also learning about the organization. But basically, don't use action learning for other things than solving problems. You don't have a problem, it's probably better to use a different methodology. Mike, have you ever seen action learning applied to something else that solving a problem?
Well, I think, Tom, you pointed out that action learning is built around having a problem. And the more urgent the problem is, the more critical action learning can be valuable for. If you have what we call a puzzle, there's a single right answer. It's a technical situation where you have to have an expert give you the answer. So if there's a single right answer, then you don't use a group of people who have different perspectives and trying to have a creative response to it. Then you don't use action learning. A problem, the definition of a problem is that there are multiple potential action strategies to solve a problem. And the action learning group will come up with the greatest solution. But if it's a puzzle, you need experts, 1 or 2 or 3 experts, how to fix the machine or how to get this particular technical thing done. And it's not used for sharing information. Sometimes a staff meeting, you have a component of staff meeting is to share information. You don't need to try to make it a group activity. Whoever has the expertise or knowledge gives it. So action learning is built around solving an urgent problem.
Okay. Thanks so much, Mike. The second component that we have here, sorry, not the second component, the second tip of using action learning in business organizations is that pay attention to the quality of questions. Now, Mike, you formulated that first ground rule that says statements only in response to questions. Reg Evans also emphasized the use of questions. Why questions, and how should we care for the quality of questions in meetings like that?
Well, there's a direct correlation between the quality of the questions and the quality of the strategies, the quality of the team, the quality of the learning. So if you get asked a great question or a group member asks a great question, I can assure you that the group will come up with a great strategy. There's a direct correlation. The greater the questions, the greater the ideas, the strategy, the greater the insights of understanding the problem. Also, the greater the question, the greater the learning. And sometimes a question, a great question, no one has a response to. They know it's a great question, but it requires reflection. It may require some additional time. Sometimes a great question stays in your mind until the next session. But in action learning, we know that great questions will lead to great strategies, great learning, and great teamwork.
Okay, thanks so much, Mike. The third tip of using action learning in business organization is if you can choose team members wisely. We basically have two kinds of or two ways of using action learning in organization. First is that it's problem focused. So you have a problem and then you summon the fellowship of the ring, so to speak, so the best possible team to tackle that problem. If you have a situation like that, look for people who can listen actively, who think systemically, who value diversity, who can look for or who appreciate different opinions, are eager to learn different opinions, are not really stuck in their positions. So look for people who are flexible and can ask questions. However, you can also use action learning to develop leaders, like Mike said, and then you have a bunch of people that you want to develop. So just make sure that in those teams you don't have any conflict, or at least you probably can have conflict, and action learning can handle that. But sometimes there are some factors between people, maybe some hierarchical dependencies, although action learning works perfectly even in teams when there is a hierarchical dependency between the manager and the subordinate. But you should probably take into account different things just to make sure those people work in those teams in the most comfortable way, because also people learn in a safe environment. So the fewer obstacles they will have at the beginning, the better they will be. The better they will be learning. Mike, is there anything you'd like to add to this tip?
Well, the important thing to realize in problem solving is that the more complex and difficult a problem is, the less valuable is expertise and the more valuable is diversity. So if in your organization you've got a very difficult problem, you don't just bring experts in, because that's what normal groups do. But if you want a creative breakthrough strategy, what you want to do is get people who think differently. So instead of you have a financial problem, instead of bringing only financial people in, you bring in non-financial people, because non-financial people have a different way of thinking. They ask different kinds of questions, and you'll get much greater strategies. Most organizations, they bring in only people who are knowledgeable about that particular problem area, and they only get a modest or a brief or not a great solution. The other thing to remember in action learning, you're changing people, not only solving the problem, you're changing people. So when you select members of the team, bring in members from different other parts of the organization, because that will break down silos. They will learn to work with people with different characteristics and perspectives. And they will learn to be more confident and develop leadership skills. So putting together your team is very important and has multiple benefits. So organizations oftentimes take the effort not only to be sure they have a real urgent problem to work on, but they bring together team members from all parts of the organization, all different perspectives, because that only solves the problem, but begins transforming the organization.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mike. Let's move on to number 4, which is skilled coaching of the action learning team. Now, what to you is skilled coaching? Who is a skilled coach to you, and how to ensure skilled coaching in the organization?
Well, the coach, when you first see the action learning coach, it looks like it's a fairly simple skill and role, but a coach has to build a great team, help everybody learn, help the group solve a complex, difficult problem. So there are a number of very important skills. The coach has to be someone who can ask great questions, who is committed to helping everyone on a team learn, develop each other. They have to listen very well. But if you get a skilled team member, skilled coach, that person can quickly transform the team so it becomes a high performance team that's working well together, keeps them on track, helps them come up with great strategies, but helps them to identify ways they can use those skills for the rest of their life and throughout the organization. So certainly anyone could play the role and be given, okay, your job is to come in at certain points and ask questions and be sure that we get finished on time and so forth. but it's like having a a medical doctor. A complex problem can be like surgery, and we would not want to have an intern or someone who's still learning how to be a doctor to work on you as you were having a surgery, particularly say brain surgery. You want someone who can do the job very well, correct every time, and get succeed in having you be cured or completing the surgery in a positive way. The same thing with an action learning coach, and that's why the World Institute for Action Learning recognizes that if you have someone skilled as a coach, the group will be very successful. An unskilled coach is, you're taking your chances. Sometimes the group will be effective and sometimes it won't be. But if you have a skilled coach who's been trained, know their job, does it very well, just like a surgeon, every time they do the surgery, they do it well. And the patient is cured of that particular, or treated well for that particular injury that they may have.
Thanks, Mike. We will now move on to 5, which is help the teams establish clear norms. Now, we know from studies that norms is the critical factor in team performance. There is a number of factors, but we know that norms, for example, are more important than who is in the team. Norms are the internal culture of the team. They are the regulations, the rules. They say what we do here, what we don't do here, what we want and what we don't want in our team. Now, a good coach will ask questions that will help the team establish norms, because every team will establish norms regardless of whether they have a coach or not. However, if a team does it consciously with the help of a coach, it's much, much more effective. The 2 most important questions in action learning are, what are we doing well? Which means, what should we continue? What are we doing that we should keep doing on? And what can we do better? So how can we change our performance? What are the aspects that we should change in order to work more effectively? So when you're hiring a coach, make sure that the coach knows how to help the team establish norms. We have a specific model in Wild Action Learning that helps ask questions that establish norms. So this is really important for the team performance, which will then directly influence the problem-solving process. Now, number 6 here is integrate learning into the action learning projects. Mike, what are your experiences about integrating learning in projects of action learning?
Well, as we've discussed thus far, we recognize that the learning is what is powerful both for the short term as well as a long-term benefit. If the group takes some time to learn, they will understand the problem better. They'll be much more creative in solving the problem. They will develop competencies that they can apply throughout the organization, throughout their life. Now, and that's a challenge because in most organizations, most leaders say we don't have time for learning. We don't have time to learn in this project. We got to quickly get to our actions and get out in 1 hour from this problem-solving session we're having. Not recognizing that if we take 2 minutes to learn or 5 minutes to learn, that may save 30 minutes of action. Most groups are ineffective. They don't work well together. They don't build on each other's ideas or knowledge. They don't know how to apply and work as a team. So, and as a person coming into an organization, we say that if you don't have time for learning, don't call it action learning and don't call us in, because we recognize that an hour of learning may be worth a year of action. We all do things and we have to do them over and over again because we're not learning. The power of action learning is that we're learning while we are engaged in the actions and the strategy. And so we believe every 5 minutes of learning may be worth 5 hours of actions. And so in action learning groups, they get done in an hour, what most problem-solving groups can't complete in a day or a month.
Thanks, Mike. Number 7 is give power and responsibility to the action learning team. Now, some teams are summoned in order to give ideas, come up with solutions, give the list of recommendations, But in action learning, like Mike said before, talking about the 6 components, it's really important that at least one action is specified at the end of the session and taken after the session. The action learning project is very much about change in the organization. So when you're doing an action learning project, it's kind of a change management program. So the people that are working in the team really need to feel that they are responsible for the effect and they really can take actions. Of course, they may want to consult with the problem sponsor, who is, for example, not within the team, a decisive person who needs to say, we can do this, but we can't go there. It's okay. But they need to feel, on the one hand, they need to feel the responsibility from the organization. On the other hand, they need to understand that they are expected to take actions and they can take actions. That the organization says, yes, you can go and change the things because we believe you are the best possible team to tackle that problem. One very, very important tip that also comes to my mind when I think about this one is that we never give the one problem to more than one team. In action learning, at least in while action learning, only one team works on one problem. Why, Mike? Why do we do that? Why do we want to give one problem to only one team and not more? After all, you can have 2, 3 teams working, and they may come up with better solutions, right? What do you think?
Well, you know, organizations have many urgent, important problems, so it's wise if you do have 2 teams, give them 2 of your organization's problems. But if I'm in a group working on a problem, and I know another group is working on the same problem, 2 things can occur. One is we don't really have to work too hard in this because the other team is going to come up with a strategy and the boss likes that team better than our team. Or we come up with great strategies and we present them to the problem owner or the corporate head, and he chooses the other group's strategies. Well, you say, well, that's the last time I'm going to spend a lot of energy working on a problem when our ideas and strategies are not being, accepted by the team. So when you're in a group, you want to know that you're the team that's responsible, you're accountable, you're going to be rewarded for what you come up with. So that's, I think, a critical reason why, whether you're using action learning or any other form of problem solving, you never have 2 groups work on the same problem to solve it.
Thanks, Mike. Now, it's also important to formulate explicit timelines and expectations when you begin an action learning program. Mike, what are your experiences here, and what expectations do you think should be said, should be articulated to the team before they begin working?
So when the problem is selected and identified, whether the CEO or the senior manager has identified a problem, and say you're the coach working with the problem presenter, you want to be sure that the problem presenter has an expected date by which the group has to deliver its strategies or implement its actions. Because if you're in a group and you don't know if and when the strategy is going to be implemented, or if it's going to be implemented at all, that takes away your creativity, your energy, and so forth. So at the very first session, they say, here's the problem, here's the date by which we will expect an action or we expect a strategy. Because without dates, there's no urgency and there's no clarity of expectations or energy that's necessary. So it's very important that the group knows its target end date, but then they can develop particular actions or time frames to achieve that.
Thanks so much, Mike. Number 9 is ensure diversity of membership in the team. You actually have spoken a little bit about this when we spoke about how to choose team members. So we know it's not specific for action learning. It's specific for most problem-solving methodologies. The team should be diverse, people with different competencies, different backgrounds. We know this from the story about the pizza man. It's a classic story in while action learning. It's in your book. Can you briefly say that story about the pizza man?
Well, this was an example. One of my colleagues, they were working on a financial problem, and typically they had financial people working on the problem, and it was a project that had to deliver a proposal to the U.S. government on handling, a financial situation nationwide. And so they were developing different strategies and developing their proposal. and it was like on a Wednesday evening, and they had to deliver their finished proposal to the government within 48 hours. And my colleague said to the group, well, I think we got to work longer into the evening because we only have another day or so to finish our proposal, and so why don't we order some pizza and keep on working. So the group agreed. It's okay, yeah, we got to get this project done tonight if we can. And so the pizza man came, and my colleague, his name was Rick, said to the pizza man, he said, geez, I remember Dr. Marquardt telling me that we needed to have diversity, and I have only these financial people around me. So he asked the pizza man, saying, I'd like you, can you stay for another hour or so? I will give you a tip, and I'll call your boss, get you released. And all you have to do is ask questions about, the project we're working on. We're working on some financial project. And so it sounded good to the pizza man, but you can imagine how it sounded to the teammates saying, we only got 48 hours, and he brings a pizza man in. But he's the boss, and so the group continues working. And after about 10 minutes, the pizza man sees some, on the chart, some arrows and some words. And he said, well, why are the arrows going from point A to point F? And the person who drew that arrow said, well, for reasons 1 and 2. And someone else says, I thought for reason 3. And then the person said, yeah, I guess you could use reason 3, and that would maybe save us an extra, $1 million by going that particular way. So the pizza man was able to ask questions that other people were maybe afraid to ask because they thought they were be considered dumb questions, or the pizza man had different perspectives. Even though he's a pizza man, he has his own personal finance, and he has to deal with money. So what happened as a result of the questions of the pizza man, the group asked better questions to each other. They were more courageous in asking questions, and they came up with a totally different plan that eventually led to a proposal they submitted to the government. The U.S. government announced a month later that they were the organization that would win this grant, and that their strategy would save the U.S. government $35 million, thanks to the pizza man. So that points out the power of diversity, but also having someone who has a fresh approach, and maybe who is not afraid to ask questions because he's not expected to have all the answers or all the expertise.
Don't be afraid to invite a pizza person to your team. Number 10, ladies and gentlemen, the last tip is engage top leadership in supporting the action learning team. And my experiences say that it's very often neglected. It's very often not taken into account, which results in poor effects of any program, not necessarily action learning program. Mike, I want to devote a couple of minutes to answer our audience's question. So can you take about 2 minutes to say, I guess, why is this important? What's the best way to engage top leadership? What would be your most important tip or cue here in this respect?
Usually, if I come into an organization, they're interested in using action learning as a way to solve their problem or build their leaders. I go to the top level I can and say, what is the most urgent problem you have in your organization? And who are the key people you want to develop as leaders? So I go and go right to the top, because the more I get the top management engaged and realize, oh boy, I'm having an urgent problem, I got it solved, and they will start having it cascade down throughout the organization. So you want this commitment, because the group is working very hard. They want to be sure that their ideas get implemented, and if their ideas can transform the organization, make it a great success, everybody's a winner in that regard. So I think if you are bringing action learning into an organization, or you're a person inside an organization and you want to introduce action learning, try to get the highest level you can and the most urgent problem that may be organizational wide to be chosen as the first action learning project that you work on.
Thanks so much, Mike. And ladies and gentlemen, these are the 10 tips of using action learning in business organizations. Now what we want to do is take a couple minutes to answer your questions. And this is the moment when you can type please type your questions in the chat box. We will probably not have time to answer all your questions, but if you have any, you're welcome to type in your questions. I can see one person is typing right now. The first question is coming up. We still have a couple minutes. So I'm going to wait until we see that question, and I will allow you, Mike, to answer it, unless it's specifically to me. But I guess we would like to hear you speak.
Location, some town in Poland, I will not be able to answer. I have to go to the expert.
Okay, we're waiting. Check if you have any questions or not. I can't see any questions appearing. Oh, Dana wrote a question, Mike. What is your most difficult situation with action learning? Is it possible to get the presentation? Yes, it's possible to get the presentation. Mike, what is your most difficult, or what was your most difficult situation with action learning?
Well, I've always felt very confident if I had an urgent problem that the action learning would be successful, that the group would come up with some great ideas, the group would enjoy being in an action group, they left with high spirits and so forth. So, but there's been a couple times where the problem presented was really not an urgent problem, or it was a problem which had been solved maybe months ago, and the person just wanted to see if their actions or strategy was the same that this leader had taken 6 months ago. And so that was very difficult because you could quickly see that the group was not engaged, the learning was not occurring, the problem presenter was not getting helped because he already had made his decision. So I'm very confident that if you use the 6 components of action learning, make sure all those are present, and you apply the 2 ground rules, you're going to come up with a wonderful experience and great actions.
Mike, Małgosia is asking, could you please say a bit more about how conflict can be solved between team members? So Mike, when you were a coach and you saw some conflict between people, what can you do?
Well, the focus in action learning is the problem. And so people have to be concerned about the problem, not about their relationship with one another. You don't improve relationships by telling people, improve your relationships. You have to use questions that enable the individuals who are having conflict to become aware of how the conflict is preventing the team from solving the problem. And so you try to keep action learning from dealing with personalities and conflicts, and to focus on the desired actions and strategies. If 2 people do not get along well with each other, have success together, that's the way conflict is handled. I worked with one group where at the end of the session, this one person said to the other person, we have been working together for 15 years. We hate each other. This is the first time in 15 years where I could see something you offered, and I appreciated that you asked me questions. And this was a conflict that had been going on in the workplace for 15 years. And one action learning session, they began to understand and appreciate each other. So that's one of the great powers and benefit of action learning, is that when there is a conflict, the questions and skill of the action learning coach enables these 2 people to, perhaps for the first time, recognize, number one, how their conflict is preventing the team and upsetting the team from accomplishing its goals, but how they can work together. They don't have to like each other, but they have to respect each other and work with each other for the good of the team and for the good of the organization.
Right. So if I were to answer this question, I would probably say make sure the first ground rule is followed, and you can ask questions like, how is this situation influencing our problem-solving process? What impact it has on the effects? How can we improve the problem-solving process with regard to how we are working together? Something like that. So you always try to ask questions that are focused towards the future and ask about the impact of, or the consequences of what's happening between the team members over the, and maybe just like you said, Mike, keep underlining that the problem here is the most important thing that we should be focusing on, right? Monica is, yeah.
I say this is an example, Tom, where you have to see action learning in action to really appreciate how action learning can accomplish the handling of conflict in a way that they would have never have understood or believed prior to being active in an action learning session.
Right. Mikola is asking, how do you deal with actions not done between meetings?
Well, you know, at the end of every session, individuals or pairs may have actions to take. And so at the beginning of the next session, these actions are checked out. So, Tom, you were to do action A. What did you do?
I didn't do it.
So Tom says, I didn't take any action. So the coach says, okay, group members, what's the impact on our being able to work today with Tom not taking action? How can we overcome the lack of information or resources that Tom was to have gathered between sessions? Tom, what would enable you to be sure to do action next time? So the coach will ask questions that will enable the group to still take some actions, but Tom becomes very aware of the fact that his lack of doing actions has impacted the entire group. And so the coach makes sure these things are brought to the forefront in a way to help Tom learn and the group to understand it. So my experience is that occasionally group members, using the culture of that group and that organization, oftentimes there is a person who may not take action. But I have never had it occur the next time. Everyone takes action every time once this is brought up, because most people are not aware of the impact of their lack of action or the way they act in a group. So the action learning coach enables the person in a supportive, positive way to become aware of the impact of their actions and the consequences of their inactions. And so we tend to do that which we get rewarded for, and we see the benefit of it. So the benefit of inaction, which was okay in the past, is no longer a benefit of inaction. The benefit of actions becomes so much more important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks so much, Mike. Now time is up and we still have 2 questions. So I want to take care of both aspects of the fact that everybody knew that we are finishing at 4 o'clock Polish time, but at the same time, Monika and Maciej have asked us a question. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on to finish off the webinar, but we, at least I can oblige myself to give you the answers in the email that I will send out after the webinar. Okay, so you will get answers to your questions, but at the same time, I want to make sure that like a good action learning coach will keep time, and we say, hey team, time is up, what's the actions? So what I'm going to do right now is say, hey, time is up, thanks so much for being here. You can see contact information to both of us, email to Mike and an email address to myself. If you're eager to see and learn more about action learning, you can go to wirepoland.org. There are a number of pages that contain articles and videos and MP3s to listen to, so you can find out about action learning more there. Mike, is there anything you want to say at the end?
Well, it's been a pleasure interacting with folks in Poland as well as throughout the world. We hope that this has given you some insight as to what action learning is and the wonderful, magical power of action learning for solving problems, developing leaders, and changing teams and organizations. So I wish you all the very best of success, and particularly those of you who are in Poland, please contact Tom and ask questions of him or get engaged and begin transforming yourself as well as your organization through action learning.
Okay, thanks so much. Again, thanks to all of you. There will be more webinars in the future, so stay tuned for the upcoming webinars, also with some people from around the world applying action learning in different organizations. So I hope you next time have a good afternoon or have a good day if you're in other parts of the world, and see you next time. Bye-bye.